How does a woman who conquered the world with a dance become a traitor condemned by it? Before she was the infamous spy, she was Margaretha Zelle, a woman who shed her past to become the enigmatic Matahari, the Eye of the Dawn. Where she captivated generals and politicians with her exotic allure. Brands with her exotic allure. The Burkonthi si Sophie, they say bore. But as the great war machine churned, the lines blurred between performance and peril, between lover and informant. The very persona she crafted for survival became the evidence for her prosecution. This is the story of her final days, a descent from a world of silk and champagne into the cold, damp reality of a military trial. We will explore the razor's edge she walked between reinvention and deception, asking whether she was a master manipulator who played a deadly game and lost, or a convenient scapegoat sacrificed to the altar of wartime paranoia. Her legend was cemented not by her life, but by the extraordinary composure of her final moments, a last, defiant performance against the backdrop of history. The first light of dawn on October 15, 1917, did not bring warmth. Instead, it was a sliver of cold, gray steel, slicing through the high, barred window of the St. Lazare facility. For the woman inside, born Margaretha Gertruida Zelle, it was the dawn of her final day. The world knew her as Matahari, a name that once conjured images of shimmering silks, exotic dances, and the hushed adoration of Europe's most powerful men. It was a name synonymous with fantasy, a carefully constructed identity that had granted her access to the highest echelons of society. But in this cold stone room, the fantasy had evaporated, leaving only the woman. The damp air clung to her, a stark contrast to the perfumed salons of Paris she once commanded. Here there were no admirers, only the unblinking eye of the state that had condemned her. The charge was espionage, a betrayal of France. But as she sat in the encroaching light, was she contemplating treason? Or was she reflecting on a life of radical reinvention, a life where the lines between performance and reality had become so blurred that even she could no longer find her way back? The persona she had built for protection and prosperity had become her cage, its gilded bars now replaced by cold iron. The Eye of the Dawn was not a symbol of a new beginning, but the final, impartial witness to the end of a legend, a story that had spiraled out of its creator's control. The world outside waited for the fall of a spy. Inside, Margaretha prepared to meet her fate with the same poise she once reserved for the stage. The cold, damp stone of her cell in St. Lazare prison was a universe away from the gilded Parisian salons, where she once reigned supreme. Here, silence was broken only by the drip of water and the distant clang of a heavy door. But in her mind, the orchestra still played. She could almost feel the warmth of the chandeliers on her skin, hear the delicate clinking of baccarat crystal, and smell the heady mix of expensive perfume and Cuban cigar smoke. Paris, in the twilight of the Belle Epoque, had been her grand stage. She was not merely Margaretha Zelle, the divorced woman from a small Dutch town. She was Matahari, the Eye of the Dawn, an exotic Javanese temple dancer conjured from pure imagination and an indomitable will. She had danced for the Rothschilds, charmed ministers of state, and shared the intimate confidence of generals on the eve of battle. Her currency was allure, her trade was the intoxicating fantasy of the Orient. In those opulent rooms, filled with velvet and mahogany, whispers followed her like a shadow. Was she a true princess? A brilliant charlatan? The ambiguity was the very source of her power, a veil of mystery that made her irresistible to men who controlled empires. Now, in the cold light of her trial, those same whispers had curdled into venomous accusations. Every powerful lover was reframed as a clandestine contact, every pillow talk secret twisted into an act of treason. The relentless prosecutor, Captain Pierre Bouchardon, was meticulously deconstructing her life's narrative, painting her as Agent 21, Her reinvention, once a dazzling triumph of self-creation, was now presented as the calculated, long-term deception of a German operative. The very persona she had cultivated for survival and fame was now the intricate web that ensnared her. Was she a master of intrigue who had finally overplayed her hand, or had the character she created simply become too convincing for a nation consumed by wartime paranoia? The line had blurred beyond recognition, and in the stark, unforgiving reality of her cell, the final performance was about to begin. The persona of Mata Hari was a masterpiece of calculated self-creation. A phoenix born from the ashes of Margaretha Zelle's disastrous marriage and provincial past in the Netherlands. In the glittering, decadent salons of Belle Epoque Paris, she was no longer a woman scorned, but a Javanese princess, a mystical dancer who claimed to have learned sacred, sensual rituals in the hallowed temples of the East. This meticulously crafted identity was both her armor and her currency. Her performances were legendary, less about technical skill and more about a hypnotic, theatrical shedding of veils that promised an intimacy with the exotic, the forbidden. She moved with an almost supernatural grace through the highest echelons of European society, a captivating enigma who collected state secrets and military gossip as easily as she collected powerful admirers. Her lovers were not merely men of passion. They were generals from both sides of the future conflict, cabinet ministers, and international financiers. The very architects of the war that would eventually consume her. Each clandestine affair was a complex transaction, an unspoken exchange of intimacy for access, influence, and the financial security she craved. She was playing a profoundly dangerous game long before any nation accused her of formal espionage. The art of reinvention is a tightrope walk over the chasm of deception. For years, she balanced with breathtaking precision. But when the cannons of August 1914 shattered the continent's fragile peace, the ground beneath her vanished. Her intricate web of international connections, once a testament to her cosmopolitan allure, now looked like a damning map of treason. The powerful men who had once showered her with jewels and whispered their strategies in her ear now saw her as a catastrophic liability. Was she a master manipulator, a genuine agent playing a double game? Or was she simply a brilliant performer whose stage had suddenly become a battlefield, her exotic costume mistaken for an enemy uniform? The line blurred irrevocably, perhaps even for her. In the cold, echoing silence of her St. Lazare cell, the dancer and the spy merged into one indivisible entity. A tragic figure ultimately ensnared by her own magnificent, fatal invention. The dance had always been her language, but now, the rhythm was dictated by unseen masters of war. In the stark silence of her cell, Margaretha Zelle replayed the fatal steps that led her into this stone cage. Was she truly Mata Hari, the spy of legend, or was she simply Margaretha, the ultimate scapegoat for a nation desperate for a villain? The French prosecution, driven by the relentless Captain Bouchardon, painted a damning portrait of a cunning femme fatale, a heartless double agent playing both sides for personal gain and German gold. They presented their irrefutable evidence. A check from a German officer, which she insisted was a lover's payment, not a spy's fee. They brandished a vial of invisible ink found in her hotel room, a theatrical prop she claimed was part of her cosmetic kit. For her, they were the artifacts of a life, lived on the stage of high society, where affection and finance were often intertwined. The line between performance and perfidy had vanished completely. Her entanglement with Captain Georges Ledoux of the French Deuxième Bureau was the most treacherous waltz of all. He saw her web of connections to powerful men across Europe not as a scandal, but as a strategic asset. He dangled the promise of 1 million francs, a king's ransom, for her to spy for France. She accepted, seeing it as a path to financial security, a final grand reinvention as a patriot. But was she dancing with a partner or a predator? Ledoux's motives remained shrouded in bureaucratic fog. He collected her reports, reimbursed her expenses, and all the while, meticulously compiled a secret dossier against her. Every move she made in the service of France was skillfully reframed as a betrayal. The game of espionage became her final, tragic performance, and she, the star, was losing control of the script written by others. Her identity, once a shield, had become the very weapon used to ensure her downfall. The trial was a stage of a different sort, one where her performance held no sway over the grim-faced military tribunal. In the stifling Parisian courtroom, Captain Pierre Bouchardon, a prosecutor with a gaze as unyielding as iron, meticulously painted her life not as a vibrant tapestry of reinvention, but as a calculated roadmap of deceit. Every wealthy lover was reframed as a strategic contact. Every cross-border journey a clandestine mission, every whispered secret a national betrayal. The narrative he constructed was airtight, sealed by the pervasive anxieties of a nation locked in a brutal war. Her own explanations, the very stories that had once been so charming and persuasive in the opulent salons of Europe, now sounded hollow and desperate in the face of his relentless logic. They were dismissed as the frantic pleas of a woman caught in a complex web she insisted she had not spun. The infamous invisible ink found among her belongings, the substantial sums of money from a German officer, which she steadfastly claimed was simply payment for her affections, a steep price for her legendary company, were presented as irrefutable proof of high-level espionage. She was no longer Margaretha Zelle, nor the exotic Javanese princess Mata Hari. She was coldly and clinically designated Agent H21. The prosecution stripped away her mystique layer by painstaking layer, replacing it with the cold, hard label of a traitor to France. In her cell, the echoes of Bouchardon's damning accusations reverberated off the damp stone walls. The shimmering glamour of her past was a distant phantom, a cruel joke set against the grim, tangible reality of her confinement. She had danced on the razor's edge of scandal and intrigue for years, but now the ground had completely crumbled beneath her. The world she had so masterfully navigated, a world of powerful men and guarded secrets, had turned on her with breathtaking and final speed. She was a scapegoat, a perfect symbol for the public sphere, and a government's desperate need for a decisive victory against an unseen, insidious enemy. The line between her persona and the person had blurred beyond recognition, and in that fatal ambiguity, her fate was being irrevocably sealed. The courtroom was another stage, but the role Margaretha was forced to play was not of her choosing. The air in the military tribunal was thick with patriotic fervor and suspicion. Here, she was not the divine Mata Hari, but prisoner H21. Prosecutor André Bouchardon, a man whose rigid morality was a weapon in itself, meticulously dismantled her life story. He painted her not as a woman who reinvented herself out of desperation and ambition, but as a cold, calculating agent of the German Empire from the very beginning. Every lover became a military contact, every lavish trip a clandestine mission, every sum of money a payment for treason. Her celebrated past in the salons of Paris, once a testament to her allure, was twisted into the perfect cover for Espionage. Her artistry was reframed as a tool of manipulation, her body a weapon used against the very nation that had once adored her. Margaretha listened from the dock, her famous poise a mask of marble, a final performance of aristocratic detachment. She countered their narrative with her own. She was a courtesan, she insisted, a profession as old as time, not a spy. Yes, she took the money, but she provided nothing of substance, playing a dangerous game for stakes she fatally underestimated. But the prosecution was not simply trying a woman. They were trying a symbol. The persona of Mata Hari, her greatest and most successful creation, was now the prosecution's star witness, the very evidence that would condemn her. In the profound silence of her St. Lazare cell, the many women she had been converged. The spotlight of the courtroom had faded, replaced by the single, unforgiving beam of light from the high window. Here, there was no audience to charm, no officer to beguile. There was only Margaretha. She traced the cold stones of the wall, the rough texture a stark contrast to the silks and jewels of her memory. Who was she really? Was she the hopeful, naive Margaretha Zelle from Leeuwarden, a girl who dreamed of a life far grander than her small town could offer? Was she the embittered Lady MacLeod, escaping a ruinous marriage and personal tragedy in the Dutch East Indies? Or was she only an ever Mata Hari, the exotic temple dancer, a fantasy she had woven so completely that she, too, began to believe it? The identities felt like costumes she could no longer remove. Each one had been a shield, a step up, a means of survival. But in this final act, the layers had been violently stripped away by her accusers, leaving her exposed. The lines between her true self and her fabricated personas had blurred into nothing. She was all of them and none of them. The world had demanded a fantasy, and she had provided it. Now, that same fantasy, which had given her fame and freedom, was demanding her life in return. The mask had fused with the skin, and she was left to wonder if there was anything left of the original face beneath. Beyond the thick walls of Saint-Lazare, France was a nation on its knees. The year 1917 was one of immense strain. The disastrous Nivelle offensive had resulted in hundreds of thousands of casualties for little gain, shattering the army's morale. Widespread mutinies flared along the Western Front, a secret the government desperately tried to contain. At home, strikes and shortages fueled public discontent. The nation was bleeding, and its leaders needed to stanch the flow of despair. They needed a villain, a tangible focus for the public's fear and rage, a distraction from the incompetence in the high command. Margaretha Zelle was the perfect candidate. She was a foreigner, a woman of fluid loyalties and questionable morals in a time of rigid nationalism. Her sensuous persona, once celebrated, now seemed decadent and corrupt. She embodied everything that a puritanical, wartime society feared. Her trial became a public spectacle, a morality play for a wounded nation. Newspapers, fed selective information by the prosecution, painted her as a monstrous vamp, a she-devil, who had lured brave French officers to their doom. She was no longer a person but a headline, a convenient narrative to explain away catastrophic military failures. By condemning her, France could perform a symbolic cleansing, purging the foreign taint and reaffirming its own virtuous resolve. She was not just on trial for espionage. She was on trial for being the embodiment of wartime paranoia, a scapegoat offered up to appease the gods of war. Confined and silenced, Margaretha's only remaining weapon was the written word. From the abyss of her cell, these were not the poetic musings of a dancer, but the frantic pleas of a woman fighting for her life. She penned letters to her lawyer, the elderly Edouard Clunet, a man who had once been her friend, but was now tragically out of his depth in a military tribunal. She outlined her defense, begged him to call key witnesses, and tried to make him understand the nuances of her life that the prosecution had flattened into a caricature of treason. She wrote to powerful men she had once known, ambassadors and ministers, reminding them of their shared pasts, hoping to evoke a flicker of loyalty or pity that might lead to intervention. Most poignantly, she wrote about Vadim Maslov, the young Russian captain she loved. She maintained that her entire ill-fated entanglement with the intelligence services was born from a desire to earn money to be with him. These letters were her lifeline, each one a message in a bottle cast into a hostile sea. But her voice was systematically stifled. Her correspondence was intercepted, read, and often used by the prosecution to build their case. Pleas were ignored. Explanations were twisted. Her words intended to further proof of her manipulative nature. The abyss did not answer. The silence that met her letters was more damning than any accusation, a confirmation that her story would not be her own. The verdict was inevitable, a foregone conclusion written long before the trial began. Guilty. The sentence was the gravest possible. When the judgment was read, Margaretha displayed no shock, no tears, only a profound and unnerving calm. The performer in her knew that this was the final scene, and it had to be played to perfection. In the pre-dawn chill of October 15, 1917, she prepared herself not as a felon for the end, but as a star for her last entrance. She declined the comfort of a nun, and instead meticulously dressed in her finest clothes, complete with a new pair of white gloves. This was her costume. When the time came, she walked from her cell with the same poise she had once used to cross the grand stages of Europe. At the sight of field in Vincennes, she faced the 12 soldiers of the firing party. She refused the offer of a blindfold. She would look it directly in the eye, owning this last moment as she had owned her life. The officer in charge moved to draw his sword. The soldiers raised their rifles. In that final, suspended breath of time, Margaretha Zelle, the woman who had been Mata Hari, performed her last immortal gesture. She brought her gloved fingertips to her lips and blew a kiss to her uniformed audience. It was an act of ultimate defiance, of grace under pressure, a final theatrical flourish that transformed a grim state procedure into a legend. The persona and the person became one, forever sealed in that silent, audacious farewell.